Renting a place to live is a new responsibility for many people entering the workforce or attending college, and it is important to understand that a lease agreement is a contract. Contracts are agreements between parties and are governed by laws and regulations. Renters should pay close attention to the lease requirements and ensure they are fulfilling their responsibilities under the agreement in order to get the most money returned from their deposit. During move-in, be sure to complete a check-in sheet when you get the keys. If your lease requires a security deposit, you have 7 days from the first rental date to complete a check-in report that notes pre-existing conditions. You may want to document any pre-existing damage with photos and note them on the check-in form. Keep a copy of the check-in sheet for future comparison. It's also important to know that at the start of a tenancy, the landlord must provide you with the name and address of a person who can be readily contacted regarding maintenance problems. When you are ready to move out, ask your landlord for a preliminary walkthrough before your final checkout. This will give you a chance to assess what needs special attention for cleaning or repairs in order to avoid potential security deposit deductions. Be sure to provide your new address in order to receive your security deposit promptly. Take detailed photos of the property during your final walkthrough in order to document the condition in which you left it. As you are setting up your new home, you may also need to establish business relationships with companies that provide services to your place of residence. These may be utility companies that supply power, water, and natural gas, or telecommunications companies for internet, cable, or phone services. When setting up these accounts, you are entering into a credit relationship that may adversely affect your credit score if payments are not made or are made late. Be sure to speak with roommates before signing up for services about who will be listed on the bills and how they will be shared. Talking about the financial arrangements for shared expenses will assist you in avoiding financial responsibility for others' expenses. Find more information on your consumer rights and responsibilities on the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection website, where you can review detailed fact sheets on a wide variety of issues. Enroll in Consumer Protection 101 by subscribing to our YouTube channel or following us on social media. More resources are available on the Consumer Protection 101 webpage at www.datcp.wi.gov.